Very simple question to start off. Are you going to support this budget?
It's not a decision we're going to make just yet. While we know there's a number of things that we fought for there in the budget, the protection for renters, the school lunch program to feed kids in school, and the medication coverage, the contraceptives, the diabetes and devices. Those are good measures. We fought for them. They're in there. But I've got some concerns. How is a Liberal government, Justin Trudeau, going to justify cutting 5,000 public sector employees and show me a plan where that doesn't mean cuts to services for people? What about the fact that they have not addressed the gap in infrastructure and housing spending for Indigenous communities, or the fact that people have waited for years or a year and a half for the disability benefit and it's only $200 at a time when the cost of living is so high? What's the plan to increase that? So I want to hear response to those concerns before we commit to our decision.
Let me start with the first part of what the concerns you raised. I think it's 5,000 jobs through attrition. The size of the public service has increased 40% under this government. So has the amount of contracting that they're doing now. Do you really believe there aren't savings to be found there?
Well, I think that we should absolutely stop spending hundreds of millions of dollars on private consultants. We should be able to do that work with the public sector. And to do that means investing in the public sector and ending the outsourcing of hundreds of millions of dollars. So I don't see how they can reconcile two.
You can't do both? You don't think you can do both?
Well, you should stop the outsourcing. Well, you should stop the outsourcing for sure. But I want to know the plan. How is this plan going to ensure that there's not going to be cuts to services for Canadians?
But if they can ensure that that is the case, then why would you kind of by nature be in opposition to the idea?
I want to hear the plan. I want to hear what the plan is to address the fact that people are concerned. You're going to cut 5,000 public sector workers and you've been outsourcing hundreds of millions of dollars for work that should never have been outsourced. Make that make sense.
You had asked for some really specific things on the revenue side, and you talked a lot about them over the past little while, in particular since the government started making these announcements. I'm thinking of a wealth tax or an excess profit tax. The government did neither of those. Is that a reflection of the lack of impact you have on them?
That's a reflection on this Liberal government and Justin Trudeau's failure to address what the major concern is that's driving up the cost of living for people. More and more economists are pointing to the fact that corporate greed, whether it's in corporate grocery stores, whether it's in the fact that we pay the highest cell phone fees in the world, whether it's in the fact that speculation and corporate landlords are both scooping up and driving up the cost of housing. Corporate greed is driving up the cost of living, and the Liberals have failed to take it on. What is shown here is evidence that the Liberals are not serious about taking that on. We are. It's also clear to me that the Conservatives, in fact, are also not serious about taking on corporate greed. Their chief advisor for the Conservative Party is a lobbyist for the largest corporate grocery store. So for them, this is not something they're interested in. We are. We think it's important.
What economic argument is there for increasing a tax on a corporation that then won't therefore be passed on to consumers and further exacerbate the cost of living crisis that they're facing?
Well, we have evidence that other countries have done this. So the United Kingdom has put in an excess profit tax on oil and gas companies because they're making record profits. And we can look at the evidence there that has not resulted in any sort of additional gouging of consumers in the United Kingdom.
Has it reduced inflation? Because their inflation rate is worse than ours.
There's other factors for that. Germany has put in place an excess profit tax. Spain has put in place an excess profit tax. Many European nations have identified this is a tool to take on corporate greed. We've said that Canada should be doing the same. We've also said specifically for corporate grocery stores, this is something the Liberals threatened to do and then backed away from it. We want to take on corporate greed. We think that's the major driver that's making life more affordable. The Liberals failed to take that on in the opportunity they had to with this budget.
But maybe that's because there isn't a sound economic argument for it. I mean, you feel that it's all about corporate greed, and I certainly wouldn't absolve them from any culpability in all of this, but do you have evidence that points to that? I mean, I think, for example, of the analysis that was done from the Competition Bureau that showed there had been the tiniest increase in profit margins. Profits as a whole, in the aggregate, have gone up, but a profit margin for a grocery chain is somewhere in the neighborhood of 4%. Is that excessive to you?
Well, it's absolutely clear to me that the Competition Bureau has confirmed that at a time when Canadians are struggling to buy groceries, those corporate grocery stores have increased their profit margins. That means they are gouging people. They are ripping people off. At first, their excuse was, our costs have gone up. Well, if the costs went up, how can it be that their profits are going up? They're not just making good profits. They're making record profits at a time of record pain to Canadians. They're making record profits at a time when Canadians are struggling. And in terms of grocery profit margins, that is significantly higher than average. If you compare that to American profit margins for grocery change, that's significantly higher.
And so you feel if there was an additional tax placed on those grocery stores, that would not translate to consumers? What tax does a corporation get that they don't charge you and I more for?
Well, the ultimate thing is we need to stop the gouging. And so we need to look at levers that we can put in place that stop them from gouging Canadians and making excess profits. Other countries in Europe, significant countries like Europe, or like the European Union has actually put in place excess profit taxes. United Kingdom, Spain,
But
Germany
show me one of
have
those
all
countries
done
where
so.
people are paying less for groceries right now.
Well, their grocery fees are much lower than Canada, significantly. Germany's are much lower than Canada.
Their inflation
United
rates
Kingdom's,
are more than Canada
but
right
their
now.
prices for groceries are significantly lower. They've taken on corporate greed in a much better way than Canada has. And we know the reason why. It's not because of any economic argument. The reason why was published in the Globe and Mail. They were contemplating, the Liberals, Justin Trudeau was contemplating putting in place an oil and gas excess profit tax. They didn't stop because an economist told them. They were lobbied by the oil and gas sector, and that deterred them. It wasn't because an economist independently said, oh, it's a bad idea. The oil and gas sector said, oh, don't do it, and they caved.
Perhaps
that shows the evidence that they are caving to corporate greed again and again.
Respectfully, though, perhaps they're looking at what Tiff Macklem said last week about the impact TMX would have on the overall GDP of Canada, which is boosting it by 0.5%. I mean, that is representative of the oil and gas sector's impact on the economy. Are you discounting that completely?
Well, that's a very separate argument for what I'm saying. I'm saying that oil and gas companies are making record profits. If they're making record profits at a time when people are paying record prices at the pumps, let's stop the gouging by putting in place a well tax. Other countries have done so. We can learn from them. This is a tool to take on corporate greed. This Liberal government has no interest in taking on corporate greed. We think that's wrong. That's driving up the cost of living for people.
Just very quickly, because some of the argument that is put forward by those corporations or people who are behind higher prices are saying it's largely, or somewhat, I should say, due to the carbon tax or the price on carbon. There has been a lot of focus on what your government's, or what your party rather, position is.
Soon to be government,
yeah,
hopefully.
right. I keep making that mistake with everybody. What your position is on the consumer side of the carbon tax. I'm really not clear. If you were to form government, would you keep the consumer price on carbon, and would you see it increase to $130 $170 a ton, by 2030?
Well, we haven't changed our position, but what we have done is I've heard a lot of concerns. And the concerns that I hear from Canadians are that we've heard from this Liberal government that they have not spent money that was earmarked for heat pumps, $14 billion that was budgeted, that was planned to be spent for Canadians. They didn't spend that, but a recent report says they're spending as much as $18 billion on oil and gas subsidies to companies that are highly profitable. Not just highly profitable, making record profits. That's unfair. And I've said the Liberal approach to this serious concern about climate change is not fair. The Conservatives have no plan. They think it's okay to continue to pollute. I think the Liberals' plan is not fair. It's not fair that they're giving subsidies to oil and gas companies, but not supporting people who want a heat pump.
Okay, so I understand that criticism, but that doesn't answer the question, which is, if you, as the leader of the NDP, were to become Prime Minister, would you keep the consumer price on carbon? Canadians are wondering what you would do on that if you were to form government.
Well, what I've said is that the current approach of the Liberal government is not a New Democrat approach. And we would have a New Democrat approach to fighting the climate change. I can give you my principles. I want a plan that takes on big polluters, a plan that is fair to working class people, and a plan that lowers emissions. That's what I want to see happen.
But what does that mean about the consumer side of the carbon tax? That's not an answer to the substance of the question.
Well, what it does is address the values that I have. And the concerns that I have is the plan that the Liberals have doesn't address these three things. It doesn't actually, enough of a way, bring down emissions. The Liberals have been missing their targets time and time again. It's a plan that workers don't feel is fair. They're seeing a disproportionate reaction towards oil and gas companies versus them.
I'm not taking away from your criticisms. I understand the validity of them, but that doesn't tell Canadians right now in this moment what you would do. Would you keep the consumer carbon tax, or would you allow provinces to substitute it with something that isn't a price on carbon?
Well, what I've said is New Democrats would have our own plan. If we were in power, we would have had a different approach to this, and we're going to lay that plan out. A part of it is making sure that a plan is fair to workers. Part of that is making sure we actually take on big polluters. And a part of that plan is a plan that actually meets our targets and reduces emissions. That's what we want.
Okay, I'm still not clear on it, but I'm going to keep asking until the election. Mr. Singh, I appreciate your time today, as always.
My pleasure.
NDP Leader Jagmeet Singh.